The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 16th chapter. From that time on, after Peter confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The Gospel of the Lord. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my spirit be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Peter is probably feeling pretty good about himself at the beginning of this gospel reading. Last week we heard Jesus give Peter a new name and give him the keys to the kingdom of heaven because he was bold enough to call Jesus the Messiah. And even without Jesus' enthusiastic response to Peter, just knowing that Jesus is the Messiah was probably enough to make Peter and the other disciples feel good. Peter and the disciples have been anticipating and hoping for and maybe even suspecting that this was true for some time, but now they know. And now that they know that Jesus is the Messiah, everything that they have been hoping for can actually happen. They are hoping that Jesus will set straight all of the corrupt leaders of the synagogues and the temple in Jerusalem. They are hoping that perhaps Jesus will drive away the Pharisees and the scribes who refuse to believe in him and who keep causing them so much trouble, and instead reorganize the structure of Jewish leadership so that they are the ones in authority. They are hoping that Jesus will march right up to the Romans who occupy the area and demand that they no longer mistreat their Jewish subjects. They are hoping, perhaps, for them to lead an army to overthrow the Roman authorities, and then after Jesus conquers them, because he is the Messiah after all, so of course he will be victorious, Jesus will give Peter and the others positions of leadership where they will have a lot of power and rule together along with Jesus. This is all a pretty fantastic vision. They have gotten their hopes up. They think that Jesus as the Messiah means that he will be able to claim the highest forms of earthly glory, power, wealth, and success, and use those to enforce God's reign on the earth. And of course, since they are the 12 people that Jesus has chosen, they assume this means that a part of that power, wealth, and success is for them too. But instead, Jesus gathers the disciples together and he says, Now I must undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. This is not what the disciples were expecting. No part of being the Messiah fits with undergoing great suffering. Certainly the Messiah cannot be killed. This does not make any sense. Peter was rewarded for being the bold one of the group last week, so he tries it again. He pulls Jesus aside. Now wait a minute, Jesus. A few days ago I said that you were the Messiah. If you are the Messiah, then this cannot be right. It is as though Jesus and Peter are acting in a play and Jesus has gone off script and Peter is trying to fix it. No, Jesus, that isn't your line. Now go back there to the disciples and tell them what we're really going to do. but Jesus is adamant that his plan is not the same as Peter's. Jesus reminds Peter that he is setting his mind not on divine things, but on human things. We may be living in a world that is very different than Peter's, but the human standards for success, or perhaps a better word would be glory, have not changed. We as human beings and as a society value strength, wealth, power, success, and fame, and we strive after whatever might help us to acquire those things. On the one hand, this is just common sense. None of us go off to school and try to fail a class. None of us would deliberately throw away the chance at a promotion. Students want to succeed. Those of us who work want to do the best job we can. This in itself is not what is problematic. But we begin to use those standards of success to measure our worth as human beings. If someone does lose, if someone does fail, if someone is unable to keep a job, suddenly they are of less value than one who has met the standards for success. We lift up and glorify the ones who are successful and ignore or publicly look down on those who are not. Soon we as Christians begin to use our religious language even as we apply those same earthly standards. So we go from if you have money, you are successful, to if you have money, you are blessed. We even use these standards to measure the success of our churches. We think a church is successful if it has more members and more money in the offering plates. Martin Luther writes about the difference between what he calls the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. Luther writes, "A theologian of glory calls evil good and good evil. A theologian of the cross calls the thing what it is." It might be that no other passage in the Gospels illustrates the difference between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross better than this one. After Peter knows that Jesus is the Messiah, he tries to use the earthly standards of success to define what that means. And because we are surrounded by the earthly standards of success in our daily lives, we do the same thing. Seeing wealth, fame, and physical health and strength and other positive attributes as signs of God's favor. Like Peter, we expect that God will act in accordance with those standards. If we show God that we are faithful, we hope that we will be rewarded in the form of earthly blessings. This is the theology of glory, for it is not about God, but it is about us. Peter takes what he hopes for and tries to make the Messiah fit into his ideas. This narrows our understanding of who God is. Of course, Peter is horrified by Jesus' words because the earthly standards of success teach us that death is the worst possible outcome. When we become theologians of glory, we fail to see how God is at work in the world in the midst of what is broken and in the company of those who are oppressed or who we perceive to be poor or weak. We lose sight of how the resurrection came to be. We can't imagine the idea of life arising out of death. But Jesus stays focused on the cross. The disciples were unable to hear the full story, but Jesus had the resurrection in mind from the beginning. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. It is the inevitability of death that God uses to bring life. First to Jesus, and then to Peter and the disciples, and then to all of us. Jesus explains the theology of the cross perfectly. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. At first, it sounds completely backwards from what we would expect. But that is because God works in ways that are completely backwards from what we would expect. We are taught to avoid even any mention of death at all costs. But Jesus promises that that is where he does his best work. Death was the way for all of us to have life. This is good news for Peter because it means that even when he was dead in the theology of glory, Jesus was already looking toward the resurrection. His words to Peter and us are not an angry rebuke, but instead a promise. A promise that no matter what kind of success or not we have in this life, we have already been claimed by God. Peter can get it exactly right in one verse and be completely wrong in the next, but Jesus' death and resurrection was still for him. Jesus did not send Peter away for his mistake. He said, "Get behind me." Get behind me is what my parents would say to my brothers and me when we were little and we got too close to the edge of the street. Get behind me is Jesus' loving promise to Peter and to us that this way of the cross is the way of life. And life behind Jesus in the way of the cross looks differently. We hear Paul in his letter to the Romans describe this new cross-filled life. Living in the way of the cross, we love each other genuinely. We hate what is evil and hold fast to what is good. We love one another with mutual affection. The world wants us to outdo one another to achieve its own standards of success. But life in the way of the cross means we outdo one another in showing honor and love. The world says to curse our enemies, but the way of the cross says to bless them. The world says to take revenge on those who hurt us, and the way of the cross says to instead help your enemy to the best of your ability. Success on the way of the cross is not measured by power, wealth, fame, or any other earthly standard. Instead, success is measured by seeing God at work in the midst of the ordinary, the broken, the small, the meek, and the dying. We see God at work in ordinary water, bread, and wine whenever we gather for worship. We see God at work in the midst of small congregations, showing God's love in big ways. We see God at work in the midst of our own sinful selves, who sometimes are ready to call Christ the Messiah and other times are quick to get distracted by our own plans and ideas. Jesus calls us, like he called Peter, to get behind him. From our new place behind the crucified and risen Christ, we are called to be crucified and resurrected people, with Jesus boldly seeking and being signs of the resurrection in the world. Amen.